Today we're going to look at photosynthesis, and this corresponds to chapter 10 in your textbook or pirate notes. Okay, pull up my pen here. Alright, so big picture guys, organisms, they need energy to live, and we can better understand life if we can understand how they harness this free energy from the sun. I'm highlighting that term because you're going to see that in the AP Biology text. If you look up the learning objectives or if you look at certain test questions, they'll mention free energy. That means energy in a system that's available to do work, aka sunlight and heat. Those are the two big ones, so light and heat. So when you see free energy, think light and heat. So the importance of photosynthesis, as far as just an individual plant goes, photosynthesis is responsible for making glucose, and the plant can then use that for respiration to get energy. Glucose also makes up building blocks for the other molecules. So we learned in the first part of AP Bio about things like cellulose and starch. If you'll remember, glucose, this is a monomer, and those things are polymers. So the plant is capturing energy in the bonds of these molecules and in the bonds that hold these molecules together. And the sun is really the starting source for all of that. As far as the entire Earth goes, the importance to life on Earth, photosynthesis is responsible for the production of oxygen. And remember, plants are not trying to produce oxygen. It's not like they needed it. It was a byproduct. And actually, for a long time in Earth's history, oxygen was toxic to life on Earth. So there was actually a mass extinction caused when plants first started coming around, or not plants, but photosynthetic bacteria, because they would produce oxygen, and oxygen actually killed off a lot of other stuff. But now, obviously, we use oxygen, and so do a lot of other living things. And of course, glucose is important as a food source. So not just glucose, but the starch and the other tissues and the proteins that glucose building block gets turned into. Okay, photosynthesis, this is the first step in energy transfer through the ecosystems. So plants, bacteria, and protists are the producers of the biosphere. They're the ones able to do photosynthesis. We give them a special name based on the fact that they can make their own food and how they make it. So these things are called photoautotrophs. Photo means light, auto means self, and troph means feeding. I forget the literal translation, so don't quote me on that, but it comes down to feeding. So this is light self-feeding. They use light energy to make organic molecules. They use it to make their own food. However, you might have also heard of deep sea organisms that live close to thermal vents. They use chemoautotrophism. So chemo as in chemical, they'll use sulfur compounds and other things as their energy source. They're way too far away from light. You might hear my cats in the background. I've got one of them attacking me right now during the notes, so enjoy that. So if we broke down living things in this world into these categories, we have the autotrophs, these first two, and then we have the heterotrophs, which can't make their own food. They have to eat the autotrophs in order to get their food. Here's some pictures to kind of put that together, and we're just looking big picture now to get you thinking about why we actually care about any of this, because it gets pretty complex. So here's some different examples of photoautotrophs. Just recognize that there's a wide variety here. Plants are the ones we talk about the most commonly, but then there's multicellular algae, which depending on who you talk to could be classified as plants or classified as something else. Then there's unicellular protists. These are little microscopic eukaryotes, so you could actually see, in this it's hard to see, but they've got a nucleus in them. And then there's also bacteria, so protists. Or not protists, my bad. Eukaryotes right here, and prokaryotes, not protists. Protists are an example of a eukaryote. So a lot of variety, but all of these things do photosynthesis. One thing worth mentioning, if we're talking about cyanobacteria or purple sulfur bacteria, think about the fact that these organisms that don't even have a nucleus can still do photosynthesis. They don't even have chloroplasts, they have chlorophyll and other structures within them that allow them to do photosynthesis. what that could tell us is that these guys might have shared a common ancestor with some of the more complex eukaryotic organisms later on. It's more likely that that is true than it is that just independently these guys and these guys evolved to use photosynthesis with the same proteins. All right, mental break. We got a new section here in your notes. So photosynthesis, overall, its purpose is to convert light energy into chemical energy of food. So chloroplasts, these are the sites inside of the cells that are the site of photosynthesis. Here we've got a look inside. These are some plant cells. And now we're looking at an actual chloroplast from inside the plant cells. If you could cut away the side of the chloroplast, you'd see that there is an outer layer and an inner layer. Think about the mitochondria. Inside the mitochondria, we had an outer layer and then the inner layer, those cristae, those folds. In the chloroplast, you don't have those folds right here. Kind of interesting. However, we have stacks of these things that we call granum, and they will actually, they'll actually do the light reactions of photosynthesis that we'll get into. Then there's the space outside these, that's called the stroma. And when you take these stacks of grana, so this is one granum, these would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grana. They're made up of these little discs called thylakoids. So inside the thylakoids, we've got this space. This is where we're going to look at the first part of photosynthesis. This is the part that we typically think of where the light gets captured. So that's just to give you context. Again, plant cell, we zoom inside a plant cell, inside a chloroplast. This is what the chloroplast looks like. Here's a 3D model of it if you could see through the plasma membrane. So there's the thylakoids in stacks called grana. Okay, so photosynthesis, this relies on multiple parts of the plant working together. And again, this is a really nice diagram, guys, just because it breaks down exactly what we're seeing. So here's a leaf, and then within that leaf, if we look at the side of it here and did a cutaway, so there's the top of the leaf, here's the bottom, we have the chloroplasts inside these plant cells. So this square I'm making here, that's a plant cell. This is a different type of plant cell in the bottom of the leaf. Each one of these is plant cells, and then the little green dots inside are chloroplasts. So you'll see there's space in between them. There's space in between these cells as well. There's also this vein coming up through here. Our veins carry, our blood vessels carry blood, of course, which gets us oxygen and water and nutrients and takes away our waste from our cells. Well, plants, their veins are going to carry water in. They're also going to carry nutrients in. They can actually take glucose and send it back out. They actually carry dissolved oxygen in. So these veins are important for the plants as well. That's how they get their nutrients and their oxygen and get rid of some of their waste, but really just transporting things around. So the veins play an important part. So do these things called stomata. These are holes in the leaf. These are kind of like, they serve a similar function to our mouths. They allow gas exchange. So in the case of the plants, though, they allow carbon dioxide in and they allow oxygen out. So without these stomata, or if they're closed, the plant can't photosynthesize because it can't get the CO2 it needs, and it can't get rid of the oxygen that it doesn't need for photosynthesis. All right, so we were in a leaf. We zoomed in. We looked at the side of the leaf. You can see how things are laid out now. With the plant cells, they have space so that air can get into the individual cells. They have a connection to a vein so that water and nutrients can get into individual cells. They have stomata so that carbon dioxide can get into these air spaces and sneak over to the cells, and oxygen can sneak out. And yeah, so now we zoom in on one individual cell right here, and within that cell you'll see all these little green looking discs. Those are all individual chloroplasts. Zoom in even closer. Here is one chloroplast, and here's a scanning electron microscope picture of one, because you might be asking yourself, like, how do they actually know what this looks like? Well, we can actually split the cells open and take sections of them. That's what this is. So this is saying at a scale of 1 micrometer, this is what those stacks look like. So this would be 1 grana stack right here, like this little guy. So just like they're showing on the diagram. Boom. All right, now that you've kind of gotten oriented here, take another look at our leaf diagram because there's some specific names here. So mesophyll cells. Meso means middle, so they're referring to these cells here in the middle of the leaf, the gooey center. So if this is an Oreo cookie, they're the gooey center right in the middle. Chlorophyll, that is the actual pigment that makes these green. A pigment is just a chemical that we see as colors, but in plants it serves the role of harvesting light. Stomata, like we said before, those are the holes that allow stuff in and out. By stuff, I mean gas. All right, so big picture diagram, come back to this, be able to explain it at those different levels. Okay, the equation for photosynthesis. This is the balanced equation, which if you've taken chemistry, it means that all of our reactants and products have all balanced out. So there's like 6 carbons here, there's 6 carbons there. You might have also seen it where it didn't have these numbers in front of these. Don't let it throw you off, guys. It's showing you exactly where each ingredient ends up in the final product. But big picture, we've got carbon dioxide, we've got water, and we have light energy. That goes in, and what comes out is glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen. Okay, this is a redox reaction. We studied those when we studied respiration. It means that one thing is getting reduced, another thing is getting oxidized. In this reaction, water is being split. So remember, that's my sign for splitting. Hope you like that. Remember that when we talked about water back in the day, we said that water is really hard to split apart. There's very strong bonds holding the hydrogens to the oxygen molecule here. So photosynthesis is impressive because this is the only process that we know of in the natural world where these bonds actually get split. So an electron is transferred with that hydrogen to CO2 and then transferred to the sugar. All right, so as far as tracking the atoms goes, this is kind of a helpful summary diagram. So remember, carbon dioxide came in through the stomata, water came in through the roots. And now it's showing you, whereas before we have this entire equation, now this diagram does a nice job of showing you, okay, the carbons actually end up inside the glucose. The oxygens from CO2, some of those end up in glucose, some of those end up in water, which is actually a byproduct of one of the steps here. The water that was taken in, some of those hydrogens end up inside of the glucose. Some of them end up inside these H2Os, and then the oxygen end up coming out as O2. How would they figure this out? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that in your mind. So remember before we said that you can take different isotopes and you can label them. So if I wanted to see what happens with this carbon, I could actually feed a plant CO2 that has carbon 14 isotopes in it. And then those isotopes are going to show up inside this finished product. So I'd be able to say, oh, okay, it must have used this CO2, because where else would it get that isotope from? You can do the same thing with the hydrogens and the oxygens. Okay, so that was overview. Now we're going into the details of the process. So for this, I would recommend that in a second you start doing a flow map here. Here they're breaking down where this term comes from, photosynthesis. So photo means light, synthesis means put together. This might look a little similar to kind of how this worked in respiration. And in your book, you might have already read that this happens in 2 distinct phases, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. It's important that you remember that this happens in 2 distinct steps because some plants can actually separate those steps, which we'll get into at the end. Okay, so I would start a new section of your notes here. Before we were going over kind of big picture. Now we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty. And the first thing we're going to start with are the light reactions. Their whole job is to do this. They convert solar energy to chemical energy. In your notes, I would make that like a big heading or put that in all caps or something like that because it's really easy to get lost in the details. Maybe even just write it and put a box around it so that you can come back to this box when you get lost and say, what in the world was going on? Oh yeah, light reactions. They're taking the energy from the sun and they're turning that into chemical energy. That's their whole job, to turn it into ATP and NADPH. Okay, so light equals energy, also called electromagnetic radiation. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. And this is the Greek symbol lambda, that's for wavelength. So if you think of violet light, that has a really short wavelength. There's my beautiful wavelength. Whereas red light has a much longer wavelength. Visible light. This is the light that's detected by the human eye. Of course, we tend to think about it because we can actually see it. Light itself can be reflected, transmitted, or absorbed. And if we take a look at the actual spectrum itself, you'll see that we're only talking about a very narrow area of the entire spectrum. So you're familiar with radio waves that actually power up, or not power up, but get you your radio stations in the morning. Then there's infrared radiation from heat, microwaves that heat up your food, stuff like that, x-rays that help you see inside. So as we go from this side to this side, the wavelengths get shorter. In other words, the frequency is higher. And this is just a summary down here. Be able to interpret this diagram. That's what you would need to be able to do. So if you looked at this, you should be able to tell that right here it's talking about the wavelength of light. So right here, 10 to the third meters, that means it actually takes 1,000 meters for it to get from one crest, boom, to another crest. Whereas this one takes 10 to the negative fifth. So we're talking nanometers, we're talking really tiny. All right, so be able to interpret a diagram like this, no need to memorize it. And, whoops, moving on. Interaction of light with chloroplasts. So here comes the light, and if we take a look at this, white light, or light coming from the sun, has all the different visible colors in it. So these colors are getting absorbed and green is being reflected. That's why we see these as green. You can also see some of that green light's getting transmitted. That's why you can stand under a leaf, look up, and it's still green. So plants aren't going to use that. All right, so I think we've all kind of been familiar with that for a while, that the plants need sunlight to do photosynthesis. Now let's kind of dive into how that actually works. So this might be a good time to do something like a flow chart. So maybe you've got some boxes with a big picture idea, and I'm trying to fit idea in here. It's not going to happen. All right. And then maybe some details under this. This is how I would recommend it. You do whatever you want. Do whatever works for you. But I would say, you know, here's our idea or our first step, and then it leads to this next step, yada, yada. All right. So big picture, photosynthesis relies on multiple pigments to capture sunlight, and this includes chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the one we always talk about, but it needs a lot of different ones. So different pigments, in other words, different proteins, different colors, absorb different wavelengths of light. Chlorophyll happens to do a good job at absorbing violet to blue and red light and reflects green. If you're having a hard time picturing what I'm talking about, think about being in a car and somebody turns the bass up really loud and you can feel it vibrating in your chest. That's your chest resonating with that. So that's your chest kind of capturing that energy from the sound wave. So you could think of it that way, with chlorophyll catching the light coming in. Oh, goody. So there's different types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A, which absorbs blue through green. And this one is responsible for the light reactions. So this is not saying that it absorbs green light. This is saying it absorbs blue up to green. And it converts these into chemical energy. Then there's chlorophyll B. This one absorbs more of the yellow colors, again, not so much with the green, and conveys energy to chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll A, I am terrible with basketball analogies, but chlorophyll A, this is your star player who sinks all the shots. Chlorophyll B gets the ball to chlorophyll A if it needs to.